A man with Alzheimer's opens the gate for a stray pit bull, and the puppy's attitude leaves everyone speechless. Miguel lived one day after another, in a routine that never seemed to change. Every morning he woke up before the sun, prepared coffee, and organized the house to welcome the day. Not because he expected visitors or because he liked everything in order, but because that was the only way he had found to give some structure to the life of Tomás, his father. Tomás suffered from Alzheimer's, and every day was a new battle against forgetfulness. As the aroma of coffee filled the kitchen, Miguel looked out the window, trying to find strength for what he knew was coming. A short time later, Tomás's shuffling footsteps echoed through the corridor. He appeared with vacant eyes, lost in a time that no longer existed. Sometimes he asked about things that Miguel had already answered dozens of times. "Miguel, where is your mother?" asked Tomás in a trembling voice. Miguel took a deep breath before responding patiently. "Dad, Mom is gone. It's been many years." But what for Miguel was an old truth. For Tomás it was a painful new thing, as if he were hearing it for the first time. It was like that every day. The same questions, the same explanations, the same pain that didn't seem to heal. Miguel tried to remain calm, but there were moments when fatigue overwhelmed him. It wasn't just physical, but emotional as well. He loved his father, but dealing with his illness was demanding. There was the frustration of not being able to help him regain his memory and the pain of seeing him forget who he was, who they were together. The house reflected this reality. Before, it was full of life, with flowers in the garden and photos on the walls. Now, she was a little faded, like Tomás himself. The photos were still there, but Tomás often didn't recognize who was in them. Sometimes he would look at an old picture of Miguel as a child and say, "Who is this pretty boy?" Miguel smiled, trying not to let his sadness show. "It's me, Daddy," he would respond. Tomás frowned, as if trying to remember, but soon changed the subject, lost in his own confused memories. There were little moments of lucidity that were precious. On some days, Tomás remembered details from his childhood, or told stories from when Miguel was little. In these moments, Miguel felt that, somehow, his father was still there. But soon the confusion would return, and Tomás would ask things like, "Have we fed the dog today?" Even though there hadn't been another puppy in the house for years. Miguel faced each of these moments with a mixture of love and exhaustion. He knew that Tomás meant no harm. It was the disease that took over, stealing small parts of him every day. Even so, Miguel continued. I prepared meals, helped Tomás get dressed, accompanied him on short walks around the yard. He was trying to fill his days with something that brought his father comfort, even if it was just a cup of tea or a quiet moment on the couch. Taking care of Tomás was a constant challenge. There were good days when everything seemed lighter, and days when Miguel felt like giving up. But he never did, because deep down he knew that, even confused, even lost in his memories, Tomás was still his father. It was a quiet afternoon. Miguel had gone out to run some errands in the city, leaving Tomás at home as usual. He had reminded his father before leaving, "Don't open the gate, okay, Dad? Stay inside, I'll be back soon." Tomás nodded, but Miguel knew that his father's memory was treacherous. In the solitude of the moment, Tomás began to wander around the house, his slow steps echoing on the wooden floor. He seemed restless, as if something was calling him outside. It was then that his eyes turned to the rusty gate at the end of the small stone garden path. Something there seemed strange, but he couldn't say what. A sound, perhaps, or just a sensation. Guided by this restlessness, he approached, his feet dragging along the ground as if the path were longer than it actually was. When he reached the gate, his trembling fingers touched the rusty lock. On the other side, standing still and motionless, was a dog. He was large, with strong muscles and white fur with brown spots. Tomás froze. His eyes, which often wandered around in confusion, fixed themselves on the animal's gaze. The two stared at each other for long seconds. The dog didn't move. He just watched him with intense amber and deep eyes, as if he could see beyond appearances. Tomás felt a shiver run up his spine. There was no way of knowing if this dog was friendly or dangerous. He looked powerful, an animal that could attack at any moment. But at the same time, there was something in his posture, something calm and almost protective that kept Tomás in place. "Who are you, boy?" Tomás murmured, as if expecting an answer. The dog tilted his head slightly as if he understood. Tomás stood there, hands still on the lock, as a cool breeze rustled the branches above them. He knew he should close the gate and go back inside, but he couldn't. Something about that animal held him there. Slowly, Almost without realizing it, Tomas unlocked the gate. The metallic sound of the lock echoed in the silence of the garden. The cub took a small step forward, crossing the edge of the gate cautiously. Thomas felt his heart race, but his feet didn't move. The animal stopped a few meters away, and the two faced each other once again. Thomas felt a mix of fear and fascination. He didn't know what to do, but strangely enough, he wasn't scared. There was something in the dog's eyes that made him feel that he was somehow safe. "You look lost, just like me," he said in a low voice. The dog sat calmly on the floor, still watching Tomas. It was as if he was waiting for something. An invitation, perhaps. Tomas hesitantly extended his hand, and the dog, instead of retreating, just remained there, motionless. At that moment, Tomas felt a connection that he couldn't explain. It was as if that animal, strong and determined, had appeared there for a reason. Even with the confusion that swirled around his mind, Tomas realized that this meeting was not a coincidence. It was as if, in the midst of his lost memory, something had found a piece of meaning. He took a step back, still staring at the dog, and said, "Well, it looks like you're staying." And he closed the gate softly behind him. The animal sat there, looking at him with the same intensity. There was no telling what would come next, but somehow Tomas knew his life was about to change. It was a peaceful night, like so many others. Tomas was sitting in his favorite armchair with a photo album on his lap. He ran his trembling fingers over the images, murmuring names and stories that only he seemed to hear. Thor, the large white pit bull with brown spots, was lying next to him, his eyes alert, as if watching every movement around him. Miguel had not yet arrived from work, and the house was enveloped in silence, broken only by the creaking of the wind in the trees. Thor raised his head suddenly, his ears erect and his body rigid. Something out there had captured his attention. He stood up, walking slowly to the door, his steps steady and cautious. Tomas didn't notice right away. He was lost in his memories as always, but Thor's movements caught his attention. "What is it, boy? Did you see something?" he asked, his voice low and shaky. Thor didn't respond, of course, but a low growl escaped his throat, a sound that made Thomas feel a chill. At that moment, Thomas heard it too, a subtle noise, as if something was moving outside. He stood up slowly, the photo album falling from his lap. He walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek out. Outside, he saw two dark silhouettes moving across the yard. Men, carrying backpacks and metallic objects that glittered in the dim moonlight. Before he could do anything, Thor was already in position. The dog charged towards the door, growling louder, the sound echoing through the house like a warning. Tomas stood still, breathing quick, not knowing what to do. He wanted to scream, to call for help, but the confusion in his mind stopped him. The intruders approached the gate, trying to force it. Thor, like lightning, ran to the gate, his heavy paws pounding the ground. The noise attracted the men, who stopped for a moment, surprised to see the large pit bull on the other side. One of them tried to drive the dog away with a piece of iron, but Thor didn't back down. On the contrary, his growl became even more ferocious. When the gate finally gave way with a crash, Thor didn't hesitate. He charged at the first man, knocking him to the ground with a powerful leap. The intruder tried to defend himself, but Thor was quick and determined. He held the man's arm firmly, immobilizing him. The other thief, seeing the scene, took a sharp object from his backpack and advanced towards Tomas, who was motionless near the door, his eyes wide with fear. Thor, sensing the danger, released the first thief and ran towards the second before he could reach Tomas. The impact was so strong that the man fell to the ground, dropping the weapon. Thor stood over him, snarling, teeth bared, as the desperate intruder tried to crawl away. At this moment, the front door opened loudly. Miguel had arrived, and upon seeing the scene before him, he was paralyzed for a moment. His father was leaning against the wall, shaking, as Thor kept both men under control. Miguel's breathing was heavy, his heart beating like a drum. "Daddy, everything is fine?" He ran up to Tomas, who was mumbling something incomprehensible, pointing at Thor. The dog, despite all the tension, maintained his firm posture, as if to say, "I'll take care of this." Miguel picked up the phone with shaking hands and called the police. "Two men tried to break into my house. The dog pinned them down, but we need help immediately." His voice was urgent, almost desperate. When the police arrived, Thor was still there, watching over the intruders like a true guardian. The agents approached cautiously, seeing the dog's size and posture. "Is he safe?" asked one of them, with the gun in his hand. Miguel nodded. "Yeah, he's just protecting the house." With a gentle command from Michael, Thor stepped back, but his eyes never left the thieves. The police arrested the men, who were now no longer trying to resist. At that moment, as the chaos subsided and tranquility began to return, Miguel looked at Thor with a mixture of relief and gratitude. He bent down beside the dog, running his hand over its head. "Thank you, Thor. You saved us." Thor looked at Miguel, his breathing still heavy, but his eyes now calm. There was no need for words. At that moment, Miguel realized that Thor was more than a puppy that had appeared by chance. He was a protector, a part of the family, and most of all, a reason for Miguel to feel that, even in the midst of difficulties, they would never be completely alone. That night, after the police took the thieves away, Miguel sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hands. His eyes were fixed on the figure of Thor, who rested near the sofa where Tomas had fallen asleep. The dog was calm now, but still maintained a vigilance posture, as if he knew he needed to continue taking care of everything. Miguel sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the day and the decision he knew he needed to make. Thor had appeared in their lives unexpectedly, but it was already impossible to ignore the impact he had made. He had protected Tomas in the house, and Miguel couldn't imagine sending him away. "You saved my father, Thor. I think this already makes you part of the family," Miguel said in a low voice, as if he were talking to a friend. The dog raised its head for a moment, as if understanding, before resting it back on its paws. In the days that followed, Thor became a constant presence. Miguel began to notice how he naturally adapted to the household routine. In the morning, while Miguel prepared breakfast, Thor followed Tomas through the garden, paying attention to every step he took. Tomas seemed more active, more engaged. He talked to Thor, telling stories from the past, as if the dog could understand every word. And somehow, it seemed like Thor actually understood. He walked beside Tomas, listening patiently, and sometimes tilted his head as if in agreement. There was one day in particular that made Miguel even more convinced that Thor was special. Tomas, in a moment of confusion, tried to open the garden gate, something he often did when he was lost in his memories. Before Miguel could intervene, Thor ran to Tomas and stood in front of the gate, blocking the way. He didn't bark or growl. He just stood there, motionless, looking at Tomas with a firm expression. Tomas tried to move to the side, but Thor followed him, always preventing him from leaving. "Why are you in the way, boy?" asked Tomas, laughing softly, as if it were a joke. Thor wagged his tail but didn't move. After a few minutes, Tomas gave up and returned to the garden, mumbling something about flowers. Miguel, who was watching the scene from the window, felt a wave of relief. He knew he couldn't always be there to stop something from happening, but now he had Thor. The dog also seemed to understand when something wasn't right. One afternoon, while Miguel was washing the dishes, he smelled a strange smell coming from the kitchen. Thor was standing by the stove, staring at a pan that Tomas had left on the fire. He barked once, loud enough to get Miguel's attention, who rushed to turn off the heat before anything worse happened. "Good, Thor," Miguel said, reaching down to pet him. "You are looking out for us more than I could ever imagine." Thor not only provided care, but also brought life to the house. Tomas, who previously spent long hours sitting, now moved more. He threw an old ball to Thor in the garden and laughed every time the cub brought it back. Miguel began to notice that his father seemed happier, more present, even in the midst of the confusion in his mind. At night, when everything was silent, Thor lay down near the sofa where Tomas rested. He seemed to understand that, even here, it was his responsibility to protect. Miguel, watching this scene, felt deep gratitude. He knew that taking care of Tomas was a mission he couldn't abandon, but having Thor by his side made everything a little lighter. Thor had arrived as a stranger, but in a short time he became indispensable. To Miguel, he was more than a dog. He was a guardian, a companion, and in a way, a source of hope amid the challenges of everyday life. For Tomas, he was a loyal friend, someone who listened to him, walked by his side, and silently brought back some of the joy that seemed lost. The house, which had previously seemed heavy and empty, now had a new rhythm. Thor had not only adapted to the family, but he had also changed it for the better. It was a sunny morning when Miguel, already with a cup of coffee in hand, stopped at the kitchen window and looked at the garden. Outside, Tomas and Thor were together, as always. Tomas was holding a hose, watering what was left of the flowers that once filled the yard with bright colors. Thor was next to him, sitting with his head tilted, watching his every movement as if he were supervising the work. Miguel leaned on the counter, smiling without realizing it. It was amazing how different his father seemed when he was with Thor. Before, Tomas spent his days in silence, staring into space, lost in the hazy memories that Alzheimer's made increasingly inaccessible. But now, there was something new in his posture, a lightness that Miguel hadn't seen in a long time. "Did you see, Thor? These flowers need more water, but not too much, otherwise we will drown them," said Tomas in a conversational tone as the water fell gently on the plants. Thor, of course, didn't respond, but followed every word, attentive as if he were an obedient student. Every now and then he wagged his tail, and Tomas let out a low laugh, the sound full of tenderness. Miguel remembered what his father was like before his illness. He was always a man full of life, who loved gardening and telling stories about when he was young. Now, with Thor by his side, it felt like part of this man was coming back. It was as if the dog brought to light something that Alzheimer's was trying to hide. That afternoon, Michael decided to join them in the garden. He sat on a wooden bench while Tomas, with renewed energy, threw an old rubber ball for Thor to fetch. "Go, boy," Tomas said, laughing like a child. Thor ran enthusiastically, caught the ball and brought it back, shaking his butt as if celebrating each throw. Miguel couldn't take his eyes off his father. Tomas seemed more alive, more present. He didn't stumble over his words as much, and his laugh was genuine. Miguel realized that these moments with Thor were helping his father find something that the illness couldn't erase, the simple joy in small things. One night, Miguel was sitting in the living room reviewing some papers, while Thor rested at Tomas's feet, who was dozing on the sofa. At one point, Tomas, still half asleep, began to run his hand through the dog's soft fur. It was an instinctive gesture, but full of meaning. Thor didn't move. He just stood there, as if he knew that touch was important. Miguel watched the scene with a lump in his throat. It was as if Thor understood what Tomas needed, even when the elderly man couldn't express it in words. That silent connection between the two was something Miguel could never offer, no matter how much he loved his father. In the following days, Miguel began to notice other changes. Tomas was more willing to get out of his armchair and walk around the garden. He even began to insist on helping with small tasks around the house, something that previously seemed impossible. Thor accompanied him through everything, like a protective shadow. If Tomas tried to reach something too high or lean too far, Thor was close by, ready to intervene, even if it was just with his reassuring presence. Miguel knew that Thor couldn't cure Alzheimer's. He understood that the disease was still there, stealing memories and confusing the days. But he also knew that Thor was giving back something that Alzheimer's could never destroy: dignity and the joy of living. Sitting in the kitchen, watching the two of them together in the garden, Miguel whispered to himself, "Thor is not just a dog. He is the bridge between what my father was and what he can still be." And at that moment, Miguel felt more grateful than ever for the presence of that faithful companion, who, silently and constantly, was helping to rebuild the pieces of Tomas's life. The days at Miguel's house began to take on a different rhythm, almost as if a new energy had taken over everything. Thor was part of that. From the moment that PITBULL appeared, he not only became the guardian of the house, but he also brought something that seemed to have disappeared: a sense of purpose. For Miguel, he was a relief. For Tomas, a reason to get up every day. One afternoon, while Miguel was in the kitchen preparing dinner, he heard the sound of laughter coming from the garden. He dropped the knife and approached the window, curious. Outside, Tomas was sitting in a chair, reciting something in a voice that sounded different, stronger. Thor was lying next to him, attentive as ever. Miguel quickly dried his hands and left, his heart beating faster. When he arrived at the garden, he noticed that Tomas was reciting a poem. It was something Miguel hadn't heard in years, since before Alzheimer's started stealing his father's words. "Life is a dream, and dreams are," Tomas said, his voice gaining a clarity that surprised Miguel. He stood still, watching, not wanting to interrupt. Each word seemed to carry not only the weight of the poem, but also a memory, a connection to a time that Tomas was rarely able to access. When he finished, Tomas looked at Thor and smiled. "Did you like it, boy?" "I've always used this poem to remind my students that nothing in life is permanent." He laughed softly, stroking the dog's fur, who wagged his tail as if he understood. Miguel couldn't hold back his tears. That was the father he remembered, that man who always had a lesson to share, who loved the beauty of words. He quickly wiped his face and walked over, still trying to process what he had just witnessed. "Daddy, do you remember this poem?" asked Miguel. kneeling down next to him. Tomas turned his head slowly, his eyes still shining with the spark of the moment. "Of course, son. It was one of my favorites. It seems like this guy here brought back good memories for me." He pointed to Thor, who was still lying down, as if he were the foundation that maintained that moment of lucidity. That afternoon remained engraved in Miguel's memory. It was as if time had stopped, allowing them to reconnect in a way he thought impossible. It wasn't just the poem or the words. That's what they represented. A renewed hope, a reminder that, even in the midst of loss, there was something that could be rescued. With Thor there, the house became a lighter place. Miguel felt less burdened, knowing that he was not alone in his mission of taking care of Tomas. He could go to work without so much anxiety, trusting that Thor would keep an eye on his father. And when he returned, he found Tomas in situations that were previously unthinkable, throwing a ball to Thor in the garden, telling stories from the past, or even touching the plants, something Miguel hadn't seen in years. Tomas seemed to have found a purpose in taking care of Thor, even if it was something simple like offering a piece of bread or pouring water in the dog's bowl. These small acts made him feel useful, needed, and for Miguel this was an invaluable gift. One night, while Miguel was reviewing some papers in the living room, he looked at the sofa and saw Thor lying at the feet of Tomas, who was dozing. The scene was so peaceful that it seemed taken from a dream. Miguel put the papers aside and picked up a diary that he had started to write. On the last page, he wrote down a sentence that had been bouncing around in his mind for days. "Thor is not just our protector. He brought us back to ourselves." Miguel closed the diary and looked at his father and the dog once again. For the first time in a long time, he felt that, despite the difficulties, they were where they were supposed to be. Thor hadn't just changed the dynamics of the house. He had transformed the lives of Miguel and Tomas in ways neither of them could have imagined. The house, once so full of silence and shadows, now had the sound of laughter and warmth. And all of this, Miguel knew, was because of that dog who appeared in their lives when they needed it most. The night was peaceful, with the soft light of the moon illuminating the garden. Miguel was sitting on the balcony, with a cup of tea in his hands as he watched Thor lying next to Tomas, who was dozing in the armchair. The dog always seemed attentive, even in his moments of rest, as if he knew that his role there was greater than just being present. Miguel let out a deep sigh. He thought about everything that had changed since Thor appeared. That dog had arrived as a stranger, an intruder, but now it was an essential part of their lives. He remembered the night of the incident with the thieves, and how Thor had protected his father in the house. But looking at Thor now, he knew that what the dog had done went far beyond that. Tomas, who previously lived lost in his own mind, now had a reason to get up every day. He smiled more, talked more, and even seemed more present, even if his memory was still failing. The walks in the garden, the little moments of playing with Thor, and even the episodes of confusion were different now, because there was a silent and loyal companion at his side. Miguel couldn't help but laugh softly as he remembered all the times Thor blocked the gate to prevent Tomas from leaving or warned him about something that wasn't right. "You're not just smart, Thor. You're wise," Miguel said in a low voice, as if the dog could hear. Thor lifted his head slightly, just enough to look at Miguel before returning to rest. It was as if he was saying, "I'm here. You can trust me." Looking at his father and Thor together, Miguel noticed something he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just Tomas who had changed. He himself was another person now. The weight I carried before, the guilt for not being able to do more, the feeling that I was alone on that journey, all of it seemed lighter. Thor had brought something that Miguel didn't even know he needed. A partner in this mission of taking care of Tomas. A friend who helped him see that, even in the most difficult situations, there was hope. While finishing his tea, Miguel took out the diary where he used to record his thoughts and important moments. He opened it to the last page, where there was still space, and wrote something that had been bouncing around in his mind for days. Thor wasn't just a guardian, he saved us from ourselves. Closing the diary, Miguel looked at Thor once again. The dog now had its eyes closed, breathing calmly, but Miguel knew that it was still alert, as always. A wave of gratitude took over his heart. He didn't know how much more time he would have with his father or with Thor, but he knew that as long as they were together, that house would be a real home. That night, Miguel went to sleep with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he was sure that, despite the difficulties, everything would be fine. And deep down, he knew that this certainty came from the amber and faithful look of a dog that arrived when they needed it most. This is our story with Thor, a dog who not only protected our home, but brought hope, joy, and purpose back into our lives. Now I want to know, have you ever experienced something like this? Has an animal ever transformed your life in an unexpected way? Share your story here in the comments. I'll love reading and chatting with you. And if this story touched you in any way, leave a like. This helps a lot and means that more people can learn about stories like ours. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are many more exciting and inspiring stories to come. Thor showed us that even in the most difficult times, there can be light. Thanks for watching, and until next time, subscribe, comment, and share.